He had buried the dream of fatherhood deep, packed it down with years of snow and silence until it was just another frozen stone in the permafrost of his soul. Elias lived on the spine of Two Fat Mountain, a name the town folk gave both the man and his rock, for he was a great, slow-moving landmass of a man whose sorrow had settled in his flesh. His wife, Ilara, had been taken by a winter fever a decade prior, and with her went the sound of laughter and the hope of children, leaving a silence so complete it had its own weight. He went to town only twice a year, a necessary and painful pilgrimage for salt, flour, and steel traps, his presence a silent rebuke to the clatter and gossip of the valley below. This time was different. A crowd had gathered in the muddy square, not for a market, but for an auction. Not of livestock or land, but of people. Orphans of a plague that had swept through the mining camps, their parents gone, their futures sold for the price of their keep. Elias meant to walk past, to keep his gaze fixed on the general store, but a voice, thin and reedy like a broken pipe, cut through the air. Lot 7. 3 head. 2 girls, 1 boy. Healthy enough for farm work, Elias stopped. On a rickety wooden platform stood 3 children, huddled together like shivering deer. A girl, maybe 12, with eyes like chips of flint, glared at the crowd with a fury too old for her face. A boy, a year or 2 younger, stood rigidly, his small hands clenched into white-knuckled fists, trying to be the man of their broken family. And the smallest, a girl no older than 5, clung to his leg, her face buried in the rough-spun cloth of his trousers, her hair a wild tangle of sun-bleached straw. They were not chattel. They were children. Something in him, a tectonic plate of grief that had not moved in a decade, shifted. The auctioneer called for bids. Silence. No one wanted 3 mouths to feed. Elias felt the eyes of the town on him, the big, barren man from the mountain. He saw Ilara's face in his mind, her quiet wish for a house filled with the chaos of small feet. He raised a hand, thick as a winter ham. "I'll take them," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble from disuse. The price was insultingly low. He paid it in coin, his gaze never leaving the children. He signed a paper that felt like a betrayal and a sacrament all at once. The defiant girl, Leah, watched his every move. The boy, Caleb, stood his ground. The little one, Anna, just trembled. He had bought them. He, who had nothing to give but a cold hearth and a vast, echoing loneliness. He had bought them, and in doing so, had bought himself a reckoning. The journey back up the mountain was a study in silence. The old wagon groaned under the weight of supplies and the 3 small, rigid bodies that sat as far from Elias as they could manage. He had bought a thick wool blanket in town, an extravagance he hadn't allowed himself in years, and had laid it on the wagon bed. The children huddled beneath it, a tiny island of warmth in a sea of cold air and fear. Elias did not speak. Words were clumsy, broken things in his mouth, ill-suited for this fragile transaction. What could he say? I am not a monster. I am just a man hollowed out by loss. The sentiments felt as useless as apologies to the wind. Instead, he drove the mule, his massive shoulders hunched against the biting air that whistled down from the high peaks. The forest grew dense around them, swallowing the thin light of the afternoon. The children's eyes were wide, darting towards the shadows between the pines. They had traded a cage in a town for a cage in the wilderness, and their jailer was a giant they did not know. When they finally reached the clearing where his cabin stood, dusk was painting the snow in shades of bruised purple. It was not a home. It was a shelter, stark and functional, with a stone chimney that had not breathed smoke for a long, long time. The hearth inside was a black mouth, filled with old ashes. Cold. He helped them down from the wagon, his large hands gentle but terrifying to them. They flinched from his touch. Inside, the cabin was 1 room, smelling of old wood, pine resin, and solitude. A rough-hewn table, a single chair, and a cot in the corner. That was all. He gestured for them to sit at the table while he began the slow ritual of revival. He laid a fire in the hearth, the scrape of flint and steel unnaturally loud in the stillness. When the kindling caught and flames began to lick at the seasoned logs, a sigh seemed to pass through the very walls of the cabin. It was the first breath the house had taken in a decade. He put a pot of water on to boil and sliced thick slabs of bread, placing them on the table with a wedge of cheese. He did not look at them, did not want them to feel like watched animals. He turned his back, pretending to be busy with the supplies, and waited. He heard a small rustle. Then another. When he dared a glance, he saw the boy, Caleb, had pushed a piece of bread toward his little sister. The older girl, Leah, just stared at the fire, her defiance a shield. But the youngest, Anna, finally peeked out from behind her brother, her eyes fixed on the dancing light. The fire was the only thing in this strange, terrifying place that felt like life. The first days were a careful, silent orbit around one another. The children were ghosts in his house, moving with a spectral quietness, their presence both an immense weight and a fragile gift. They slept together on a pallet of furs he'd made for them near the hearth, a small, breathing mound in the darkness. Leah's glare never softened. She was the sentinel, the fierce guardian of her small flock, and she watched Elias with an unblinking suspicion that he both respected and feared. Caleb was the observer, his eyes following Elias's large, capable hands as he mended a leather strap or sharpened his axe. He was a boy caught between his sister's hardened distrust and a burgeoning curiosity. It was Anna, the little one, who made the first move. She was a creature of instinct, not yet fluent in the brittle language of trauma and betrayal. For her, there was only the cold and the warmth, the hunger and the food. The fire was her anchor. She would sit for hours, mesmerized by the flames, her small face illuminated by the flickering light. One morning, as Elias sat at the table, methodically cleaning his hunting rifle, a task that was as meditative as prayer, he felt a small pressure against his leg. He looked down. Anna was standing beside him, her tiny hand resting on the coarse wool of his trousers. She didn't look at him, but at the rifle parts laid out on the oilcloth. He froze, his hand stilling over a piece of polished steel. He expected her to recoil, to be frightened by the weapon, but she only pointed a small finger at a brass casing. He picked it up and placed it in her palm. It was warm from his touch. She closed her fingers around it, a small, secret treasure. Then she looked up at him, her eyes clear and deep as a mountain lake, and offered a hesitant, fleeting smile before scurrying back to the safety of the hearth. It was not a surrender. It was a truce. That evening, he began to carve. He took a piece of scrap pine and his sharpest knife, and as the fire crackled, he slowly worked the wood. Shavings fell to the floor like dry leaves. He was not an artist, but his hands knew wood. By the time the children were asleep, a small, rough-hewn bird lay on the table, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. He left it there, a silent offering in the language he understood best. Winter tightened its grip on the mountain, burying the world in a deep, soundless blanket of white. Survival became the rhythm of their days, a non-verbal liturgy of shared work. Elias never ordered them, he simply did what needed to be done, and slowly, they began to follow his lead. He would go out to check his trap lines, and soon Caleb would trail behind him, a silent shadow in the snow, watching how he baited a snare, how he read the tracks of a snowshoe hare. Elias would hand him a freshly caught rabbit, and the boy would take it, his face grim with the reality of it, and carry it back to the cabin. Leah, seeing her brother participate, began to emerge from her defiant shell. Her distrust was still there, but it was now tempered by a pragmatic need to learn. When Elias showed Caleb how to skin the animal, she watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, memorizing every movement. The next day, when he brought in another, she stepped forward and held out her hands, her chin set in a stubborn line. He handed her the knife. He guided her small, cold hands with his own massive ones, showing her how to make the first cut, his touch surprisingly gentle. It was a profound transfer of knowledge, of trust. Inside the cabin, the sterile tomb of his grief was slowly being transformed. The scent of baking bread now mingled with the smell of pine. Small smudges appeared on the single window pane. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with the soft sounds of breathing, the scuff of small feet, the quiet industry of four people learning to exist in one space. He carved more animals. A lumbering bear for Caleb, who was sturdy and serious. A clever fox for Leah, whose eyes missed nothing. And one night, he finished the bird he'd started for Anna. He sanded it smooth with a piece of worn leather until it felt like a warm stone in his palm. He set it beside her sleeping pallet. In the morning, he watched as she woke and discovered it. She gasped, a small, sharp sound in the quiet room, and clutched it to her chest. She spent the rest of the day with the wooden bird, making it fly through the air, whispering stories to it that he couldn't hear. That evening, as he mended a tear in Caleb's worn coat by the firelight, the boy spoke for the first time, his voice rough. "Why'd you buy us?" The question hung in the air, direct and heavy. Elias stopped sewing. He looked at the boy, then at Leah, who was also waiting for an answer. He thought of Ilara, of the echoing emptiness. He chose his words carefully. "Felt like I had more room than most," he said, his voice a low rumble. And this mountain's too quiet, it was the truest thing he had said in 10 years. The fragile piece of their shared existence was shattered on a night when the wind howled like a hungry wolf outside the cabin walls. The fire burned bright, a defiant heart against the storm. Caleb was practicing tying knots with a piece of rope Elias had given him, and Leah was reading from one of the few books Elias owned, her finger tracing the words slowly. Anna was asleep on her pallet, the wooden bird tucked under her chin. Elias was banking the embers for the night, his movement slow and methodical, when he felt it again, a small, hesitant touch on his arm. He turned. It was Anna, her eyes wide with the remnants of a dream. She looked at his face, her expression one of strange, distant recognition. And then she spoke, her voice a clear, quiet whisper that cut through the sound of the wind. "Elias," he froze. The poker in his hand grew heavy, his knuckles white. The world seemed to stop, the wind, the fire, the very beating of his own heart. It was not a question. It was a name. His name. A name no one on this mountain had spoken in a decade, save for the echoes in his own mind. He had never told them his name. To them, he was just the man, the giant who had bought them. He knelt slowly, his knees cracking, until he was at her level. "What did you say, little one?" he asked, his voice strained. Leah and Caleb were now watching, their own activities forgotten. Anna pointed a tiny finger at his chest. "Elias," she repeated, with the simple certainty of a child. "Mama said your name." A cold dread, colder than the wind outside, washed over him. He looked at Leah, whose face had gone pale. The defiant mask was gone, replaced by a raw, remembered fear. "Our mother," Leah said, her voice barely audible. "She knew you. From before." "Before him? Before who?" Elias pressed, his voice gentle but firm. "Our uncle," Caleb choked out. "Silas Croft. Mama said if anything ever happened, we should try to find a man named Elias. A good man who lived on a mountain. She said you were a friend of our father's, a long time ago. She wrote you a letter, but Croft found it. He said you were dead." The pieces slammed together in Elias's mind. He remembered the father, a fellow trapper from years back, a good man who had died in a rock slide. He remembered hearing the man's widow had been taken in by her husband's brother, a slick talker from the mining camps named Croft. He had thought no more of it. He had been too consumed by his own grief. The letter. She had tried to reach him. And now her children were here, delivered not by a letter, but by fate's cruel auction block. He was not their savior. He was a failed promise. And Silas Croft was not a ghost from the past, he was a coming storm. The thaw came to the mountain, slow and then all at once. The snow receded, revealing the damp, dark earth, and the streams swelled with meltwater, their roar replacing the winter's silence. The change in season mirrored the change inside the cabin. The children's fear had thawed, replaced by a tentative, resilient hope. But with the spring came the accessibility of the mountain pass. The world below could now reach them. The name Silas Croft was an unspoken presence, a shadow that lengthened with the days. Elias felt a shift inside himself, a hardening of purpose. The passive grief that had defined him for a decade was burning away, leaving behind the hot, fierce steel of a protector. He was no longer just a man surviving, he was a father defending his territory. He began to prepare. He took his rifle down from the wall more often, not just to clean it, but to hold it, to feel its weight, to reacquaint himself with it as an extension of his will. He took Caleb into the woods, no longer just for trapping, but for training. He taught him how to move without a sound, how to use the landscape for cover, how to read the signs of an intruder, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of leaves. He was teaching the boy to be a hunter, but also to be the hunted. Leah watched them go, her flinty eyes understanding the unspoken reason. One afternoon, she approached Elias as he was chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound in the clearing. "He will come for us, won't he?" she asked. It was not a question of if, but when. "Yes," Elias said, not pausing in his work. "Then you have to teach me, too," she insisted, her voice trembling but resolute. "Teach me to use that." She nodded toward the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. He stopped, the axe buried in a log. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her young face, a mirror of the fire now burning in his own gut. He had wanted to shield them from violence, to preserve what little innocence they had left. But the world didn't allow for such luxuries. He pulled the axe free and nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. "We start tomorrow." The mountain was no longer a refuge from the world, it had become a fortress. The four of them were no longer strangers thrown together by chance, they were a garrison, united against a common enemy. The peace they had built was a fragile thing, and they would all have to fight to keep it. The first sign came a week later. A single set of footprints, not his own, near the edge of the woods. A scout! Elias found them at dawn and spent the day erasing them, his face a grim mask. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. The man who arrived was not the monster Elias had pictured. Silas Croft was slight, dressed in town clothes that looked absurdly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the mountain. He had a thin, manicured mustache and eyes that were small and close-set, glittering with a shrewd, transactional greed. He did not come with an army, only one other man, a hulking brute with a vacant expression who looked more like a piece of equipment than a person. They emerged from the tree line as the sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows before them. Elias had been waiting. He was sitting on the porch steps, his rifle laid across his lap, seemingly at ease. Inside the cabin, he knew Leah, Caleb, and Anna were huddled together, silent and terrified, following the plan they had rehearsed. Croft stopped a dozen yards from the cabin, a smirk playing on his lips. "Elias," he called out, his voice smooth and oily. "A ghost from the past. I heard you'd gone to seed up here." Seems the rumors were true. Elias said nothing. He just watched the man, his presence as solid and unmovable as the mountain behind him. His size, once a mark of his grief and isolation, was now a wall. "I've come for my property," Croft continued, gesturing vaguely toward the cabin. "A legal matter. They are my wards, my kin." "You have no claim they ain't property," Elias said, his voice a low growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. "And they ain't your kin." "Not in any way that matters." Croft's smirk tightened. "Ah, the noble savage. Look, mountain man, I have the papers. A judge in the valley gave me custody. You are harboring fugitives. You can give them to me now, and I'll forget this happened. Or things can get unpleasant." He glanced at the large man beside him, who cracked his knuckles with a sound like breaking branches. This was the moment. The culmination of his long winter of sorrow and the short spring of his rebirth. He was no longer a man hiding from the world, he was a man standing his ground for the small world he had built inside his home. He slowly rose to his full, formidable height, dwarfing the two men before him. The rifle in his hands no longer looked like a hunting tool. It looked like a final answer. "You're not setting foot in this cabin," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You're not taking them. Your road ends here." Croft's facade of civility finally cracked. "You fat, stubborn fool," he hissed. "You think you can stop me?" He gave a sharp nod to his man. "Get them." The confrontation exploded. The hulking man charged forward, a mindless battering ram aimed at the porch. Elias didn't raise the rifle to fire, that was not the plan. A gunshot would be a final, irreversible act, and he was fighting for life, not death. Instead, he swung the heavy weapon like a club, catching the charging man across the side of the head with the solid wood stock. The crack echoed in the clearing, followed by a grunt of pain as the man staggered, stunned but not down. Silas Croft, seeing his advantage faltering, pulled a small, wicked-looking pistol from his coat. He was a coward, relying on tools he didn't have the stomach to use properly. He aimed it not at Elias, but at the cabin door, a cruel and calculated threat. "Get out of the way, old man, or the girl is first," he shrieked. But Elias was not an old man. He was a force of nature awakened. While Croft was distracted, Elias moved with a speed that defied his size. He lunged forward, closing the distance in 2 great strides. He grabbed the wrist of Croft's gun hand, his massive paw engulfing it completely. He squeezed. The sound of small bones snapping was sharp and clean. Croft screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and the pistol clattered to the ground. The other man had recovered now, his eyes blazing with stupid rage. He threw himself at Elias, wrapping his arms around his thick torso, trying to wrestle him to the ground. It was like trying to tackle an oak tree. Elias grunted, the impact driving the air from his lungs, but his feet held firm. He was fighting on his own ground, fueled by a decade of repressed grief and a few short months of fierce, protective love. He drove his elbow back into the man's face, then again. He could feel the blood, warm and sticky, on his shirt. He was no longer a gentle giant, he was a cornered bear, and his cubs were watching from the den. He shoved the man away, sending him stumbling back. He then turned his full attention to Croft, who was cradling his broken hand, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. Elias picked him up by the front of his fine coat, lifting him effortlessly until his feet dangled above the ground. He brought his face close, his breath coming in ragged gusts. "You will never come back here," Elias snarled, his voice a terrifying whisper. "You will forget their names. You will forget this mountain. If I ever see your shadow in this valley again, I will hunt you down." He threw Croft to the ground like a sack of garbage. The man scrambled away, sobbing, his brokenness complete. The hulking brute, seeing his master defeated, hesitated for a moment, then turned and fled back into the darkening woods. Elias stood there, breathing heavily, the silence of the forest rushing back in to fill the void. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his body bruised and aching, but he had held the line. The cabin door creaked open. Leah stood there, her face streaked with tears, holding his old wood-cutting axe. Behind her, Caleb clutched a heavy iron skillet. They had been ready to join the fight. They were his family. The aftermath was quiet, almost reverent. The adrenaline faded from Elias's veins, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache and the sharp sting of his wounds. He sank down onto the porch steps, his head in his hands, the sounds of his own ragged breathing loud in the twilight. He had met violence with violence, and the taste of it was bitter in his mouth, but the sight of the closed cabin door behind him was an unparalleled sweetness. The door opened again, not with a creak of fear, but with a soft click. Leah emerged, her face pale but her eyes clear and steady. In her hands, she held a bowl of water and a clean rag. She knelt in front of him, wordlessly, and began to clean the gash on his forehead. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firm, mimicking the gentleness he had once shown her. Caleb appeared moments later, carrying a small tin of salve that Elara had used to make. He didn't speak, just placed it beside Leah and stood guard, his small shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the woods where the men had disappeared. They were tending to him, protecting him in turn. This simple, silent act of care was a bond forged stronger than any legal paper. The next day, Elias went down the mountain, leaving Leah in charge with the rifle and strict instructions. He found the town sheriff, a man named Peters who knew of his history and his loss. He told him everything, his words spare but honest. He expected a long, complicated legal battle, but Silas Croft, it turned out, was a wanted man, a swindler with a long list of grievances against him in the mining camps. The custody papers were forgeries. Croft's attempt to reclaim the children was an act of desperate greed, not familial duty. Sheriff Peters listened, his expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. "They're better off with you, Elias," he said. No one's gonna argue that he drew up new papers, simple documents of guardianship that felt more real and binding than any marriage certificate Elias could remember. When he returned to the cabin, the documents in his pocket, he found the three of them waiting on the porch. He didn't need to show them the papers. They could see the resolution in his eyes. That night, as he sat by the fire, carving a new piece of wood, Caleb came and stood beside him. He watched the knife peel away the layers of pine for a long time. "Are you our father now?" the boy asked, his voice soft. Elias's hand stilled. He looked at the boy, then at Leah listening from the table, and at Anna asleep by the fire. He thought of the empty years, the silent cabin, the dream he had buried under snow. "I suppose I am," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Caleb nodded, a small, solemn gesture. "Papa," he said, testing the word. The word landed in the quiet room and broke the last of the ice around Elias's heart. He wasn't just a guardian or a protector. He was a father. 10 years passed. The snows came and went, and the seasons turned on the spine of Two Fat Mountain, but they were no longer markers of solitude. They were the rhythm of a family's life. The cabin was no longer a stark shelter but a home, expanded with a new room that Elias and Caleb had built with their own hands. A garden flourished in the clearing, bright with the greens of beans and the reds of ripe tomatoes, tended by Leah's capable hands. The sound of laughter was common now, a sound Elias had once thought he would never hear again. He was older, his hair more silver than brown, his great size softened by age but still a reassuring presence. He was Papa Elias, a name that fit him more comfortably than his own skin. Caleb was a young man now, tall and strong, with his father's quiet competence and Elias's knowledge of the mountain in his eyes. He could track a deer for 2 days and build a shelter with nothing but what the forest provided. Leah, at 22, was a woman of fierce grace and intelligence. She had read every book Elias owned a dozen times over and had started a small trade, bartering her intricate herbal remedies and preserves with the people in the valley, bridging the gap between their world and the town below. She was the heart of their home, her flinty gaze having softened into a look of watchful, unwavering love. Anna, now a vibrant teenager, was the joy of the mountain, her spirit as untamed as the wildflowers that grew in the high meadows. The wooden bird Elias had carved for her still sat on her windowsill, its wings forever poised for flight. Their family had even grown. For years after the confrontation with Croft, Sheriff Peters had brought them another child, a silent, hollow-eyed boy found abandoned at the edge of the woods. Without hesitation, they had taken him in, wrapping him in the same warmth and patience that had healed their own wounds. His name was Samuel, and now he was Caleb's shadow, learning the ways of their quiet life. One late summer evening, Elias sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Anna was showing Samuel how to skip stones across the small pond they had dug. Caleb and Leah were talking quietly by the garden, their heads close together. The silence was not empty, it was full. It was the silence of peace, the silence of belonging. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from decades of work and from one single, brutal fight. They were the hands that had buried a dream and then, against all odds, had built a legacy. He had not been given a family by blood, but he had forged one through love, in the heart of the wilderness, on a mountain that was no longer named for his size, but for the magnitude of the life he had built there. He was not the barren man, the grieving recluse. He was a father. He was home.